I'm Mark Lowcock. I'm the independent chair of the inquiry into the Sheffield street trees dispute. Thank you very much for joining us again. Could I ask you please to tell us your name and your role?
Yeah, thanks Mark. My name is Andy Buck and I chaired the independent tree panel from its inception in late 2015 until the 5th of June 2017 when the panel concluded its work.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I really appreciate you coming and talking to us today. A couple of things just to confirm you understand the base on which we're doing this. Firstly, this is being live streamed and recorded, and after the session we will make the recording available to anyone who wants to watch. You're okay with that?
Yep, fully understand.
And secondly, the dispute was a period of quite high anxiety and stress and upset for a significant number of people across the city, and we need to be careful in these sessions that I'm doing, these conversations I'm having with people, that we don't inadvertently have anything said which is defamatory or libelous, or maybe brings into the public domain personal information which should be kept private.
Of course.
In the very unlikely event that we run into an issue there, we will flag to you that we're a bit concerned and ask you just to be careful, and in extremis, if we couldn't resolve the problem, then I might have to curtail the hearing, but I'm not expecting us to be in that position.
I hope not.
So you, like everybody I'm talking to, have been sent a list of topics we'd like to discuss, but could I invite you please just to make tell us anything you'd like to say by way of introductory remarks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for including the work of the independent tree panel in the inquiry and in this today's hearing. As I said, I chaired the independent tree panel from late 2015 until June 2017, and since then I've had no substantive involvement in the street trees issue, save for a meeting in June 2018 with the then leader of the council, Councillor Julie Dorr. I also had a conversation with Councillor Lewis Dagnall when he assumed cabinet responsibility for Streets Ahead. To be honest, I can't remember exactly when that happened. So therefore, today's conversation is taking place over 5 years since I concluded my involvement with this issue. It was therefore really helpful to get your questions in advance, and I've used them to prepare. A couple of other comments. The ITP, Independent Tree Panel, was asked to play a very specific role, which I think we're going to discuss today. Some of your questions, particularly later in the conversation, reach somewhat beyond the role of the ITP and therefore my formal role in this issue. I'm very willing to discuss those questions, but I just want to emphasise that what I'll be offering is essentially a personal view, informed of course by my chairing of the ITP, and I certainly won't be offering a view on behalf of the 5 members of the panel. A couple of other things. In preparing for today, I looked back at my ITP records. I'm pretty sure that what I'm about to say is accurate. I'm also going to mention some data. And again, to the best of my knowledge, the data is accurate and complete. But I haven't gone back and done the numbers again, so I'm kind of keeping my fingers crossed about that. And the last thing I wanted to say is I'm not a trees expert or a highways expert. In this role, I think I was genuinely a lay person, albeit one with a background in senior leadership and management in the NHS and latterly the voluntary sector. And I guess it was my independence that caused the council to approach me to play this role. One other thing, I have prepared some notes, so every now and then I'll be looking at them during the course of the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you so much. That's all extremely clear and helpful and very open and constructive. I really appreciate the way you've laid all that out, so thank you. So the first thing, again really in a way for context, is if you could just tell us when you first became aware of the street trees dispute, as far as you remember.
Well, I guess probably in 2014. certainly in early 2015, but then I couldn't put a date on when the dispute began. So about then.
Okay, very good. So when and how were you approached about the ITP and asked to chair the ITP? And what view did you form on why the council was seeking to set up the panel and what the council's objectives of the panel were?
Well, I was approached by James Henderson, the council's Director of Policy, Performance and Communications, in late 2015, and he explained to me that the council had decided to set up an independent panel to review its plans for street trees. It was clear from the outset that the review would take place within the framework of the Streets Ahead contract, the core question being whether an alternative to removing and replacing a number of street trees was possible given the provisions of the contract. I think I should say why I agreed to do this. First, it was very clear to me that the dispute was doing serious damage to the city. Our reputation was being damaged. Inordinate time and energy was being absorbed by the dispute. Other, in my view, at least equally important issues were not receiving the same public attention, and so on. And therefore, if I could help to bring some kind of resolution to the dispute, I was willing to try. And secondly, I genuinely believe that the council was looking for a way to resolve, or at least diminish, the dispute. I also think it's important to say I wasn't paid to chair the panel. Rather, my then employer, Citizens Advice Sheffield, of which I was at the time chief executive, was paid for my time. I, of course, ensured that all of my Citizens Advice responsibilities were fully discharged, whilst I also chaired the panel.
So it was a public service you were offering, essentially.
I think so. Yes.
Yes.
And I've lived in Sheffield now for 41 years. I'm proud to have made it my home. It's a great place to live, and as I say, if I could help to bring some kind of resolution to what I believe to be a pretty damaging situation, then I was willing to try.
Thank you. No, very good, very clear. So could you just tell us about discussions you had about the nature of the panel and your role as the chair?
My discussions about the panel in terms of reference were with James Henderson, with whom I negotiated the terms of reference. There were two things I was really clear about. Firstly, that all the panel could do would be to offer advice. It would be for the council to make decisions and to bear responsibility for those decisions. Secondly, I was really clear that the panel's relationship would be with the council, not with its contractor, Amy. That doesn't mean to say we didn't have some interaction with Amy personnel. We did, but the primary relationship would be with the council. And James, on behalf of the council, was entirely receptive to those key points and to other points I made about the terms of reference. Can we go on to say a bit more about the terms of reference?
Yeah, please do, and the composition of the panel.
Sure. The terms of reference were finalised in early 2016. I'm not certain when the council published them. I'm sure they were pretty sure they were in the public domain before we began our substantive work, and certainly before we offered our first advice. I discussed the composition of the panel with James, which, as you say, Mark, was obviously pretty important. And we very, very clearly needed professional as well as lay expertise. And the membership is recorded in the terms of reference, as well as myself, an arboricultural consultant and professional, another Andy Bagshaw, an independent health and safety advisor, Philip Duckett, a highways engineer, David Graham, and another lay member, Jackie Stubbs. The calibre of people we found, in my view, was first class. It was excellent. In my view, they all demonstrated genuine independence throughout the process. As I say, their names and backgrounds were published and included in the terms of reference. And it would be inappropriate of me to not say again that I really appreciate the work that they undertook with me. It was a pleasure working with all four of them. I think together we brought to bear the knowledge and experience required to fulfil the panel's task.
Very good. There's just one thing I want just to check on all that, which is extremely clear. And I'm not sure whether you'll remember this or not, but so far as you remember, when the panel was established and your colleagues were identified and agreed to serve in the role, did anybody raise any question about the professional sort of qualifications or capability or appropriateness of any members of the panel?
Not that I recall. No, not that I recall.
Okay.
Which means if they did, I've either forgotten or I didn't raise it with me,
right,
or it wasn't raised in a particularly significant manner.
Yes, indeed.
Have you heard to the contrary?
No. It's not. That's not the reason I ask.
Okay.
The reason I ask is just to clarify whether essentially there was any controversy or questions raised about who was on the panel. But as far as you're aware, at the time it was established, that wasn't the case.
Not as I recall at all. And as I say, I'm absolutely confident in saying that the panel acted fully professionally and crucially independently.
Yes.
And that, of course, was very, very important.
Yes. Okay.
The nature of the panel.
Indeed. Thank you. That's an important point you've clarified very helpfully. So my next question relates to the adequacy or otherwise of the information you were given when establishing the panel, and anything you can tell us about the discussions you had with the council and Amy potentially about the scope of the work of the panel.
Well, the scope of the work of the panel is set out in the terms of reference. We're going to come to the household survey, and I'm going to say some more about how we kind of refined the approach that we were going to take to fulfilling the terms of reference in a moment.
Very good.
We'll kind of come back to that, I think. On the 17th of December 2015, the panel was briefed about the Streets Ahead contract and crucially about the provisions in the contract for about street trees. And a copy of that presentation is in the archive. I've got one here today.
Yes, I think I've seen that.
I hope so. And the most important part of the presentation, as we will see, was information about engineering solutions. We were also passed a copy of a presentation that had previously been used at the Highway Tree Advisory Forum, which set out the available engineering solutions, and we were given other documents that provided yet further information about engineering solutions, as well as a copy of the 2012 to 17 5-year tree management strategy. And I think taken together that was perfectly adequate. Excuse me. Was all the information that we needed about the context within which we would carry out our work. We'll come back to engineering solutions in a while.
Okay.
Of course. The information we were then provided about individual streets and trees, which was in the form of tables and maps, was very helpful. I think I've got some recollection of making some suggestions about how the exact presentation of that could be refined to make it more helpful, which was willingly received by council colleagues. Crucially, it told us what we needed to know, which streets, which trees, and why the council was proposing their removal and replacement.
Okay, very good, thank you. You mentioned in your last response the survey of residents,
yes.
And I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about the process for surveying residents, and then the process for considering options and developing recommendations about trees and streets.
Yes, of course. Well, the first thing to say is the panel didn't survey residents.
Right.
The City Council did so,
Right.
and it was the Council's decision to do that. A decision that, as I understand, was made as part of their decision to establish the panel in the first instance. Residents were asked whether they agreed or disagreed with the Council's proposals for the trees on their street. If a majority of respondents agreed with the proposals, then the street would not be referred to the panel. If a majority disagreed with the proposals, or indeed the respondents were equally divided, the street and said trees would be referred to the panel. We were provided with data about the response rate for to the survey, and about the numbers of people responding, saying yes or no, as it were. And indeed, I included that data in the advice notes, advice letters that we sent back to the council. Shall I continue to talk about the process?
Yes, please do.
When I agreed to do this, I hadn't quite anticipated this, but it very quickly became clear that the only way that we could offer an independent, professional view about the council's plans for each tree would be to inspect each tree. And I hadn't anticipated going on a tour of the city, but we did. And as I say, I judged, and other members of the panel concurred, that this was the only way that we could arrive at an objective, independent, professionally informed opinion. So we embarked upon said tour of the city to inspect trees. We developed and followed a clear, structured process based on a series of questions. First, does the tree still exist? And as I shall mention, some of the trees referred to us had already been removed before we got to inspect them. Next, is the tree dead? And indeed, we found some dead trees, in which case, of course, we would advise that those trees should be replaced. Next, is the tree dying or diseased? Which, of course, is a slightly more subjective opinion. There's a judgment to be reached there. We may advise in such a case that a tree was kind of so far gone, as it were, that it should be replaced. Save for cases where there was a reasonable prospect of the tree recovering, in which case we'd advise a kind of watch and wait approach. I don't think there were any instances where we said keep a dead tree in situ for ecological reasons, because of course, although the tree itself may be dead, it continues to be in a way a living organism. But I don't think there are any such instances. Next question, is the tree dangerous? For example, we found some trees that were unstable. We found others that caused a serious hazard to pedestrians and or drivers. An example of that would be a tree that obstructed the sight line at a pedestrian crossing. We advised that it should be removed. As it happens, it remains in situ today.
Right.
We found at least 2 trees requiring what our arboriculturalist said was immediate action, because they posed an immediate risk of either falling over or significant limbs falling off, in which case we advised the council to take immediate remedial action. And in the case of a tree that presented a danger, we were likely to, of course, to recommend, to advise that it be removed, and where safe to do so, a replacement installed. Next question: is the tree damaging? And that, as I guess you've learned, Mark, became in a way the most controversial question. We found some trees that were damaging third parties' property, in which case we would be likely to advise replacement. Not many instances of that, but some, and it clearly would be sensible to replace those trees. We found many more trees that were without doubt damaging the pavement, curb, and/or carriageway. And the question then was whether that damage could be satisfactorily resolved, which is where the engineering solutions moved to centre stage. We'll come back to engineering solutions, if that's okay.
Yes.
And then our final question was, is the tree discriminatory? And the reason that was the final question was because it was whether, even after engineering work, the tree would continue to impede some people's use of the pavement. For example, people with pushchairs, people using wheelchairs, people with limited mobility, people with sight impairment. Would they be able to safely use the highway, crucially the pavement, in such cases? And we did indeed find some instances where even with the application of engineering solutions, a tree would continue to prevent the safe, easy passage of people, crucially along the pavement, in which case we would also advise removal and replacement. Now it's really important to note that our inspections were visual. Apart from Andy, our arboriculturalist, using a hammer, because you can find out whether the tree trunk is hollow or not.
Right.
Apart from that, we carried out visual inspections. Crucially, we did not undertake, nor were we equipped to undertake, excavations. So we were unable, therefore, to unearth the exact extent of damage that tree roots might be causing. I think that the necessity for this street by street, tree by tree, pretty laborious approach is borne out by the approach that has been taken since the dispute was resolved, which, as I understand it, involves multi-party inspections, including excavations, on a tree by tree basis.
Right. So
the position we've arrived at now in the city, I think, bears out the necessity for the approach that we took. Following our inspections of the trees on a given street, and when we had arrived at a view, I submitted our advice by way of advice letters, one for each street, tree by tree by tree, to the council, addressed in the first instance to Simon Green, the then responsible executive director, and subsequently to Paul Billington after Simon had left. Paul assumed director level responsibility for this. Got some data,
please.
And this is where my earlier caveat. I have not, in preparation for today, gone back and redone all the numbers. So please bear that caveat in mind. My records indicate that we inspected 782 trees on 149 streets. 26 trees had been removed before we got to them. We advised the council to replace 440 trees. I'm going to say a little bit more about that number later. We advised the council to deploy alternative measures, engineering solutions, to retain 316 trees. My understanding is that in the first instance the council decided to accept our advice to retain trees in about 25% of cases, and therefore of 782 trees referred to us, I think about 75 or so were to be retained, which is what, less than 10%. The council undertook to publish the advice letters and its subsequent decisions. It did so, although there's of course a very important point about the timing of said publication in relation to Rustlings Road.
Yeah. Are you coming back to that at some point?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, I'd like to ask you about that
Of course.
if it doesn't come up in one of your other answers.
Well, I think it would be difficult to have this conversation without mention of Rustlings Road.
Yes. So, in 75% of the cases where the panel recommended retaining the tree, roughly 75%, where the panel recommended retaining the tree, the council didn't accept the advice of the panel.
That's what my data tells me.
Right.
But Mark, if we want to get an absolute fix on that, because as you can tell, I feel a little bit nervous about this point.
Yes, no, that's completely fine, and we have access to all the data.
If we want to do some more number crunching, which would be entirely sensible in my view, and if we find that that my records are awry, then I'll hold my hands up and say, well,
that's fine. That's completely fine. I'm just establishing here what from.
But it's very clear to me that in a substantial number of cases, our advice was not accepted by the council.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
And when we talk a little bit more about Rustlings Road, we'll have a pretty good example of that.
Yeah. Okay. You ran through some of the considerations in your mind when you were deciding what advice to provide to the council. You went through the various categories of tree. Are there any other factors you considered when providing advice to the council on what to do about a particular tree?
No, I don't think so. Because we wanted to provide as objective a view as was possible.
Yes.
I'm going to say something a little later about informal conversations on the street with residents and members of the public,
right.
Which are very interesting. We tried hard to not be influenced by those conversations. I will say a bit more about that, actually, and then maybe say why I think it would have been inappropriate to,
yes. Okay, very good.
to take that fully into account.
Okay. Is there anything you want to tell us about discussions you had with the council and Amy during the process of conducting the panel's work about the advice you were providing?
Well, two conversations in particular come to mind. One was with the then Chief Executive John Mothersole and the then Executive Director Simon Green. And I wanted to tell them that the advice we would be submitting would suggest that a significant number of trees could be saved by the use of engineering solution. I kind of just wanted to give them advance warning of that, which seemed a sensible thing to do. I also recall a conversation with James Henderson, in which I remember saying, you do realise that the absence of an engineering solution within the contract for trees where the trunk is kind of growing into the carriageway, so it butts out from the curb line, or where the trunk overhangs the carriageway, that the absence of solutions for those trees would result in trees being removed and replaced that could otherwise remain in situ. Again, come back to that point in a moment. But apart from that, I don't recall any substantive discussions about the advice we were providing.
Okay, thank you. So let's come on to the engineering solutions and other alternatives to replacing the tree that you understood to be available to the council, namely under the contract. And anything you'd like to tell me about how your knowledge of the options and, in practice, what the constraints were, developed as time passed?
Indeed. This, of course, was central to our work and central to the dispute, I think. We were advised by the council that the Streets Ahead contract provided for 14 engineering solutions. They were listed in the presentation we were given. They are listed in the 5-year strategy. Reference was also made to another, I think 11 solutions, which would require additional funding, which is not available. Now, our understanding was that if one or more of the 14 solutions was appropriate, could be used to retain a tree, then Amy, the contractor, was obliged to use it or them, in some instances more than one such solution. And we therefore advised in numerous cases that such solutions should indeed be used. Now, to this day, I do not know whether we were properly informed by the council about the availability of engineering solutions. At no point were we told that the use of any of the 14 solutions would depend upon their cost. However, as you'll be aware, the local government ombudsman has reported on 2 cases concerning street trees. In the Ombudsman's report dated the 18th of September 2020 about the case brought by, I think, a late resident of Rustings.
I think he's referred to as Mr. G.
Mr. G, yeah, in relation to Rustings Road. The report says the following. I'm going to quote. Mm-hmm. It says, paragraph 107, the published version of the strategy also formed the basis of the instructions given to the ITP. The council therefore embarked on a process of consultation, the household survey, and independent review that referred to a strategy containing elements that it had never followed and never intended to. Paragraph 108. We find this led to the council not using engineering solutions to retain trees on Mr. G's road despite the ITP advice to do so and their availability. We note in 3 cases where the ITP advised retaining a tree, the council did not dispute the availability of an engineering or alternative solution, but rejected it on grounds of cost. Cost was not directly mentioned in the published strategy as a reason for not carrying out an engineering solution to retain a tree. And my understanding is that the council accepted that Ombudsman's report. If that's the case, that suggests that the ITP may, and I really want to emphasise may, because I don't know what the answer to this is, Mark, may have been misled. And if indeed that was the case, then personally I think that's pretty serious. And if your review can clarify that question, I think that would be helpful.
Yes.
I sincerely hope that we were not misled. I'm not looking for that to be the outcome, but I think you'll understand when I read that report, Ombudsman's report, I thought, well, crikey, really? Yes,
in fact, the Ombudsman goes on to make further statements about what he concludes from this, which obviously is something I'm aware of, and we'll look at that as well.
Sure.
So let me just make sure I correctly understand your view on one point.
Of course.
I assume, is it the case that you thought you could reasonably rely on what the council had told you and given you to understand about the availability of engineering solutions under the contract?
Oh, absolutely. I entered this process completely in good faith, and I had no reason to think that anything to the contrary when I embarked upon the process. And I certainly believe that all 14 said solutions were readily available, and that Amy would be required to make use of them if, by doing so, trees could be retained.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else? You probably covered this already, but just to double check, whether there's anything else you want to tell us about how your knowledge of the options and constraints developed over time. You learned things from the 2020 LGO report you've told us, but I don't know if there's anything else in that category.
I don't think so.
Okay.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So my next question is if you could give us your views on the decision-making process that was followed by the Council and Amy about the advice provided by the panel.
Well, Mark, I don't think I know what process the Council followed, and indeed I was not asked by the Council to discuss the advice we provided. So let's use Rustlings Road as the example. We submitted our advice. I didn't have any further conversations with the council. They didn't come back and say, why did you reach this view? What about this? Did you consider this? So in that sense, the submission of the advice was the kind of end of our contribution, if you will. What does appear to be the case is that in at least one instance, possibly more, the council went to pretty extraordinary lengths to obtain evidence to support arriving at a different view, which I have to say I find pretty surprising. Didn't quite seem to be in the spirit of the process that we were undertaking. What's more, the council in the first instance published information about the decisions it came to in a format that was, to all intents and purposes, completely unreadable. It was an enormous spreadsheet condensed to a PDF. You need an A1 printer or screen in order to read the stuff. I've got some examples here if you want to look at them. They're just illegible.
Yeah.
I told the council that was unacceptable, and just served, of course, to irritate people even further.
Yes.
It's really daft.
Yes.
They subsequently did improve the presentation of the information. But I have to say, Mark, I decided at the time, and I've not done so in preparation for this hearing, I decided against ploughing through the council's decision documents in an attempt to understand why our advice was being rejected.
Okay.
And in preparing for today, actually, I've asked myself the question: should I have insisted on having an in-depth discussion with the council about why it was rejecting our advice in so many instances. Perhaps I should have done. Perhaps more significantly, I think perhaps the council should have said, can we have an in-depth discussion about this? And that did not happen.
Yeah, okay. Just to check if you remember one thing, I think we know the answer to this, but do you remember, or have you come across it in researching, when you provided your advice in respect of what to do on the trees on Rustlings Road?
Just bear with me. I have a copy of it with me. So I've got.
Take your time, that's fine.
I've got it. It's dated 22nd of July 2016.
Right.
And was submitted by email. This is an important point because the council had this advice for quite some time before it acted. I'm pretty sure I could check that date and probably pull up. I think I can pull up the email actually. So if you want, we could try and make absolutely certain.
Well, as it happens, that is the date I remember on correspondence I've seen. So but it's helpful to know that you've got something in front of you. Which, Now, did you hear anything further from the council in respect of that piece of advice?
I don't think so.
Do you recall when you first heard what was going or what had happened on Rustlings Road?
Well, I'm pretty sure on the day it happened,
Right.
because somebody would have said, "Have you heard, Andy?"
Right.
And I remember thinking, "Oh my goodness."
Hmm. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
So crikey. Because I'm now trying to remember whether I knew ahead of the council's action that our advice was not going to be followed.
As I think you probably know, the council published its reaction to your advice very early in the morning of the 16th of November, following which it carried out its action. It didn't publish its response to your advice before that.
No, it published the advice and its response at sort of in the early hours of the morning, as it were, and then embarked upon removal of trees an hour or so later, if I understand the timeline correctly. Is that right?
Seems to be quite a lot of evidence to that effect, yes. So, but you also don't remember anything between submitting your advice on that and... I'm not saying... I mean, feel free to go back and check whether that you've got something in your records, but as of now, sitting here today, you can't remember anything of that. So fine. So just something else that I wanted to ask you about this kind of process, which is... generally speaking, do you remember roughly how long it took between your submission of advice and when you knew what the council was going to do, and whether you have any sense of how long there typically was between the council giving notice of its response to your advice and then taking whatever action it was going to take?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay.
I think we could find out, probably, because all of our advice is dated,
yes,
of course, and can probably, as I say, turn up the emails that submitted that advice. And it's conceivable that the date of some emails is a little different from the date of the accompanying bunch of letters,
Indeed.
But not radically.
Yes.
So, and presumably we can establish when the council published its decisions, so we could get a fix on
Yes.
the variations in that time gap.
Indeed. The only reason I ask you now is in case there's anything that's stuck on your mind about that bit, but there isn't in your memory. That's fine.
No.
The next question is whether there's anything you'd like to tell us about how the recommendations of the panel were responded to or received or viewed publicly from what you could see.
Well, so far as I'm aware, our advice was accepted, not necessarily agreed with, but accepted by the public and by campaigners as being reasonable given the constraints under which we were working. Crucially, the constraints imposed by the engineering solutions. I did not follow this dispute on social media, I think for understandable reasons. Had I done so, perhaps I would be able to say a bit more in response to this question. What I can say is that, save for one or two very specific examples, I received no direct public or campaigner criticism about our work. So I didn't have campaigners getting in touch, and I was readily available.
Yes.
To say, what on earth do you think you're doing? This is all completely outrageous, and so on and so forth. That didn't happen. So, and I kind of think probably the absence of that suggests that what we'd done was, as I say, accepted as being reasonable, if not necessarily agreed with.
Yes. Okay, I understand your perspective on that. Yeah, very good.
Let me just say something else about the conversations on the streets, because during our visits to 149 streets, we of course spoke informally to quite a lot of people. I mean, this is Sheffield, after all. People who wondered what we were up to, and are you the council? Are you about to chop the tree down? Everyone was really friendly. I might add, it was. They were good conversations. But the thing is, we heard a great variety of views. Some people absolutely desperate for a tree to be saved, to be retained. Others equally keen to see a tree removed, for all sorts of reasons. And then from other people who were perhaps pretty kind of neutral about the trees themselves, but were deeply concerned about the impact that the dispute was having in the city. And the latter two groups, people who were desperate to see trees removed, and indeed people who were deeply concerned about the dispute, included people on streets that came to be at the heart of the dispute. And I simply want to say that I think all of those people's views are legitimate. And I think it's also almost certainly the case that residents with views contrary to those of the campaigners felt that their voices were not being heard nearly as loudly as those of the campaigners. And I came across one or two people who were, to be frank, hesitating to speak up. Which I think is regrettable.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So, I suppose, in the light of everything you told me so far, what would you say about how far the panel achieved its aims, and who might have done what differently to deliver a better outcome from the process?
Well, I think the panel fulfilled the task it was set. As I said earlier, we pretty quickly concluded that the only way that we could provide independent, objective, professional advice was by going and looking ourselves, which is what we did. We provided advice about all the trees on all the streets that were referred to us, as I say, I think we did so professionally, objectively, and independently. What that didn't do, of course, is lead to a resolution of the dispute. During the course of our work and thereafter, the dispute escalated, which is a matter of great regret and disappointment. So the first question about that is, I think, would there have been a different outcome had the council accepted and acted upon our advice? And I think that in late 2015, when the panel was set up, in the first part of 2016, that was perhaps conceivable. And probably up to the point of the Rustlings Road event. Had all those solutions been genuinely been available, and I might say, had an additional solution been firmly brought into play about those trees with the trunk overlapping the curb line or leaning into the carriageway, if the council had accepted and acted upon our advice, the number of trees to be replaced on the streets referred to us, which of course doesn't include the streets where a majority of respondents to the survey said, yeah, we agree with the proposals. The number of trees to be replaced would have been 440. Had that additional engineering solution, which I'm pretty sure has subsequently been used, I can think of at least 2 streets where I'm pretty sure I could take your mark and say, look, this has been done. Had that been rendered available, I'm certain that we would have advised that many more of those 440 trees could have been retained. Now, we cannot say, can we, whether that would have paved the way to a resolution of the dispute. I think it would have lessened the scale of the dispute. And perhaps this is the moment to kind of use Rustlings Road as an example. Not just because of what happened, but because I happen to think it's quite a good example. So as I say, we advised that of the 8 trees referred to us, 2 should be replaced. Mark, I can visualise these trees. One was leaning at a right angle over, not right angle, about 65 degrees, I think, was the measurement into the carriageway, and there was vehicle impact evidence and so on and so forth, and it, in our view, needed to be removed and replaced. Another tree, a huge, beautiful, mature tree, was causing such disruption to the pavement that even with engineering solutions, it would be impossible for somebody, for example, in a wheelchair to pass. It was discriminatory.
Right.
We advised, unfortunately, that it should be replaced. Then we advised about a third tree, that some further kind of testing should be done. A swept path analysis was suggested because there was a question about whether the tree, if retained, was kind of impeding the line through which buses would pass. So we were uncertain about whether, for road safety reasons, that tree could be retained or not. We advised that 5 trees could be retained with engineering solutions that we believed were available we've been told were available within the contract. So what I wonder is what would have been the outcome if the council had sat down with residents in the first instance, but also with campaigners, some of whom won't have been residents on that street, and said, we've received the ITP's advice, we've looked into this further, we're going to replace 2 trees, possibly 3 trees, and we'll use engineering solutions to retain the other 5. Would that have resolved the Rustlings Road dispute? Well, I certainly would hope it would have done. I really do. I think there was very, very good reason for us advising that 2 of those 8 trees should be removed and replaced. I also think there was good reason for us advising that 5 could be retained. Of course, we'll never know whether that would have resolved the dispute. Of course, self-evidently the case is the council's subsequent actions dramatically escalated the dispute, and I think that to a degree that probably rendered the scope for arriving at a resolution drawing upon the ITP process much more difficult, because of course positions were hardening quite significantly. I've got a second slightly more sort of fundamental question here, which is, of course, whether there was a kind of basic flaw in the idea underpinning the establishment of the ITP. Essentially, we were treating the problem as one that could be resolved kind of logically and objectively within the framework of the Streets Ahead contract. And at the time, that probably not an unreasonable approach to be seeking to take. What became clear is that what was required was a kind of political solution to this, not what I've described as a sort of logical solution within the framework of said contract. And indeed, the eventual outcome, as I understand it, was what I would characterise as being a political solution. Now, I don't think the ITP was equipped to bring about that sort of solution. It took at least 1 or 2 further substantive rounds of process to arrive at a settlement, if you like, to the dispute.
Okay. Drawing on your actually rather substantial experience of public policy and public service, do you have any comment on the wisdom of establishing something like the ITP and given what its aims were, which were partly, as I understand it, to give people confidence about what was happening, and then in a significant number of cases, sometimes with essentially no notice, not following the recommendations? Do you have any observation about the likely effect of that on public trust and confidence, or other things that would have followed from taking that approach?
I think arriving at a position whereby you've established an independent panel, the panel gives advice, as I've said on more than one occasion this afternoon, think objectively, professionally and independently, and then in a significant number of cases deciding to reject that advice does call into question the wisdom of setting up the process in the first instance. And it goes without saying, doesn't it, that then kind of publishing advice and response to it, and within hours acting upon decisions made, that's not good public service management in my view. And of course, and it did without question serve to escalate the dispute. Shall I say a bit more about my thoughts about this?
Yes, please do.
Although Mark, this it was your final 2 questions that gave me most cause to hesitate.
So just so that people watching know the discussion we're about to get into, I told you I would want to ask you for your broader views, beyond the particular role you played on the panel, on and because you're somebody who's lived in the city a long time and you've had responsible positions of public service in the city, on whether, with the benefit of hindsight, you have views on who might have done what differently to forestall the dispute or to allow it to be resolved sooner.
Well, as I say, this question and your final question, are the ones where I've kind of hesitated really, because this is where I'm offering not a chair of the ITP view, but essentially a personal view. Mark, I've got huge respect for people who are willing to be councillors. I've worked in one way or another with elected members for 35 years, and I've got great regard for people willing to play that role. I've also got similar regard for people who are willing to play senior management roles. At the best of times they can be fantastic, albeit difficult roles. When the going gets tough, they can be utterly thankless. And of course, our city council has faced huge challenges over the past 15 years.
Yes.
Huge challenges, not least of which has been the really serious impact of the government's austerity cuts, coupled particularly with the inexorable rise in the need for children's and adults' social care, which of course absorbs a very significant proportion of the council's budget. And it's also the case that the problem the Streets Ahead contract sought to address, the appalling state of many of our streets, was a pressing one, and one for which, arguably at least, the Streets Ahead type of solution was the only viable solution available at the time. So that what I'm going on to say, I really want to be heard in the context of those observations. I think the following questions deserve consideration. So forgive me if I'm going to sort of pose some questions rather than suggest answers. So were senior councillors and senior officers exercising sufficient grip over this whole issue? Who was making the key decisions? To put it bluntly, was proper control being exercised over this situation? Was the relationship between council and Amy appropriate for a contract of this importance, size and complexity? Had the client-contractor relationship become blurred? And even if it hadn't become blurred, did the council have sufficient people with the necessary skills and authority to properly hold Amy to account? In other words, were the contract compliance arrangements robust? And I think we learned many, many years ago that if you're going to use outsourcing, you have to have really good contract compliance arrangements, and you have to invest in making sure that's the case. Now, Mark, I've been told by a council officer within the past year that the Streets Ahead contract is a self-monitoring contract. Well, that certainly leads to me asking the sorts of questions I've just posed. So another thought. It's pretty clear, isn't it, that the true campaigners were intent on taking on the council. I think they'd probably say that. That was their, they were going for it, weren't they? They were well organised, they were determined, they were resolute, they were willing to embark upon a campaign of civil disobedience, is that the right description? In pursuit of their aims. they were willing to be arrested in pursuit of their aims. For example, I think that's that. I've used the term civil disobedience. On the other hand, it seems to me the council was intent on having its way, and the legal proceedings against the protesters, the extraordinary events on Rustlings Road, and confrontations indeed on other streets, I think are evidence that both sides, as it were locked into this dispute, which was kind of getting out, to a degree at least, getting out of control. Now, is it ever sensible for a public authority to be thus engaged? In particular, a local authority faced with protests by some of its citizens. I'll say a bit more about that right at the end, if I may. But that said, to the extent that this may have been a matter of cost, and certainly bringing further engineering solutions other than the 14 to bear would, as I understand it, have required further investment being made by the council into the contract. So to the extent to which it was a matter of cost, of the council being determined to spend not a penny more on streets ahead in view of other pressing, competing priorities, and I've mentioned social care for both children and adults, for example, then I would have a fair bit of sympathy with the council's underlying position, because I'm going to say a bit more about the challenge of competing priorities when resources are really, really tight in a moment. That said, conducting early morning tree felling operations or engaging in protracted standoffs with protesters was only really going to, in the short term at least, make matters worse rather than better. So how long did it take for the council to eventually accept that it was going to have to kind of pretty fundamentally change its approach in order to resolve this deeply damaging dispute? That didn't happen until pretty serious political, managerial and reputational capital had been expended, and well after we'd completed our work. And I think this boils down to questions of culture, of values, beliefs, behaviours, relationships, of politics, power and priorities, and finances, and as I say, the really serious competing calls upon the council's increasingly stretched resources. Your next question kind of flows from this, but I guess you'll want to ask.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a very interesting and illuminating kind of assessment there from your perspective. And then, yes, I also, in the terms of reference I have prepared for my inquiry, am keen to contribute to ensuring that the risks of similar problems in future re-emerging are minimised. So yeah, okay. I'm very keen to hear from you on that topic.
We could have a very, very long conversation about this, but we won't. A few things spring to mind. I think the council has embarked upon a process of resetting its relationship with citizens and communities, and I think that's a very, very important process. The new committee system and the local area committees provide a framework within which that can happen. They're not the solution, but they're the framework in which it can happen. I think the council needs to be as open and transparent as it possibly can be, and I think that it should transform the way it engages with individual citizens, with communities, with community groups, and therefore with citizens as a whole. I think it should be at all levels. So this is from the micro operational to the big strategic, at all levels, be open to and welcoming of feedback and indeed criticism. However, as well as that, I think it's incumbent upon everyone who is active in the city to recognise the scale and complexity of the challenges facing the city. We've got tens of thousands of people, in some instances, to all intents and purposes, whole communities facing deepening poverty and inequality. Shockingly so, in my view. I've mentioned twice, I think, the pressure on social care. The climate and ecological crises are really important. The future of the city's economy. We've got some enormous challenges facing us, and the council, of course, is at the heart of rising to those challenges. And it is already the council faced with an enormous financial challenge, one which I fear is in danger of becoming even worse if the new government presses ahead with a further round of deep austerity cuts. And what that situation demands, of course, is vision, priorities and strategy. What sort of city do we want to be in 5, 10, 20 years' time? What are the most important things for us to do, and how should we go about doing them? And that will involve making pretty tough choices that the council, as the elected body, is ultimately responsible for making. And I think that people who are active in the city, in community organisations, voluntary organisations, campaigning organisations, I think it's incumbent upon us to recognise that context. And of course it's then possible that the council will make choices to which some people will fervently object and may indeed seek to resist. The question then becomes, well, how should the council conduct itself in that kind of scenario? Well, with patience, openness and transparency, disclose as much information as it's possible to disclose, explain carefully and clearly, continue to talk and engage, and so on. Don't pull up the drawbridge. Let the drawbridge down, I would say. Be on the front foot, identify the potential risks and flashpoints, and I can think of a few, Mark, as I sit here now. Be really clear about how you're approaching that. Use the multi-party governance that there is now in place in the city as a consequence of the outcome of recent local elections. But what should the council do as a matter of last resort? I don't know, to be frank. If you can offer wise words about that, I'm sure that would be most welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for all of that. It's very helpful to hear all of that from you. Thank you. So, unless there's anything else you'd like to say, I think that brings us to the end of the hearing. But is there anything else you want to mention?
I don't think so, thank you.
Okay.
I hope my contribution will be useful.
Indeed, I can tell you it is extremely useful. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.
So, Charles, we can stop the hearing. Thanks very much.